Season 1. So Season 2, which you had last summer, of course, you had two different iterations. You had Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series Season 2. You had Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series Brazil.
No Snoop Dogg on either one of them.
No. And listen, the Brazilian season had a lot of really good fighters. Obviously, one super fighter who, listen, I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. The biggest star for the Brazilian series, and if you don't remember anyone else from that season, Johnny Walker has to be the standalone breakout star.
All of it.
You could say Johnny Walker's the biggest star of Dana White's Contender Series.
And
everybody's going to think, he fought on Contender Series? He did. It was at the end of the season on the Brazilian season. But listen, Johnny Walker with the recently announced Corey Anderson fight that you were talking about earlier.
If he beats Corey Anderson,
he gets a title shot. And if you listen to the conversation that he had with Pete Carroll on Eurobash this week, listen, it was an awesome one because he's been training at SBG. His full training camp, which it's not going to be that long, but it's going to be in Russia. And Pete asked him, is he going to come out with the Russian colors? And he said, yeah, sure. Why not? I'd love to represent Ireland as well. That was another one of the questions. But
so he's the new Russian Hammer?
Well, I'll just train wherever. And Johnny Walker he's so charismatic. His fights are so much fun. He injures himself in his cellies. The guy's a lot of fun. So Johnny Walker, of course, encompasses everything.
Exactly.
So that's pretty much all you really need to say about the Brazilian series. But if you look at just Dana White's Contender Series as a whole, and the reason why I'm doing this is because not that it's vague, but to tie into Season 3. So you look at Season 2, the first guy that I really look at, and a guy that, listen, I mean, he's a finisher. He fights really smart. You can tell that fight IQ's there, is Super Sodiq Yusuff. He's already 2-0 in the UFC, put on a great performance on the Contender Series, and he's one of those guys, again, incredibly charismatic. Nigerian MMA is without a doubt on the map, and this is one of those guys that's really pushing it. Sodiq Yusuff, too. You look at the fight that he had in Australia, he beat one of the Anzac fighters as well, and one of the Mokhtarians. So Sodiq Yusuff, for me, is one of those breakout stars of Season 2.
Exactly. And we haven't really seen him as much as we've seen sort of other guys from that same season even. It's just, you can tell that his skill set's one of the more UFC ready. I mean, for instance, when you watch, because I'm a big basketball fan, when you watch the NBA draft, sometimes they'll say this guy was really good at college, but his game doesn't really translate all that well to the NBA. Sodiq Yusuff's one of those guys who his skills definitely translate well into the big leagues.
Yeah, exactly. So Sodiq Yusuff, one of those guys that's really, really done well for himself here coming out of Season 2. Another one of those fighters that, listen, incredible life story.
Insane.
A great article.
Channing Tatum might play him in a movie.
Yeah, on the Players Tribune. Ian Heinisch, a guy at middleweight that they put him up against a couple of tough tests.
He's fighting Derek Brunson soon.
And I mean, listen, he fought Shoeface. He got in a couple of really tricky spots. Able to get the win there. Mutante, able to get the win there as well. And yeah, I mean, the fights just keep getting bigger and bigger. But this is one of those guys coming in from LFA that it was like he was primed for success there. I had a feeling watching the regional promotion that, listen, this was one of those guys that was going to make an immediate impact. But this is a fighter that, like, not just MMA people are talking about him, which is always good for the sport. And I think his ceiling's really high at middleweight.
So do I. I mean, you look at his skills. He's fought two primary grapplers, even though that's not really his strength. And he's done extremely well neutralizing their game plans. I know
his defensive wrestling's really good.
It's
really
amazing.
Good.
I mean, when you saw like the rolls that he used to get out of Shoeface's kind of takedown attempts,
they were spooky.
Yeah, it was insane. And him fighting Derek Brunson next, I mean, Derek Brunson is kind of the stereotypical gatekeeper of a division, but he's a very dangerous one at that. I mean, I know he had that terrible fight with Elias in his last one, and not to make this all about Derek Brunson, but if you beat Derek Brunson, it's kind of off to the races after that. Like, there's no more easy tests after that. And not to say he's had any easy fights before that, but Ian Heinisch has definitely put himself in the perfect position to get into that. Like you said, we're probably not going to see any of these guys get title shots this year or next year, but Ian Heinisch seems to be... He's probably going to be the first Contender Series guys, other than Johnny Walker, of course, who might get that title shot, just because his skill set's so developed, and he's really shown that he is well-rounded in every aspect.
Now, there's two female fighters that, in my mind's eye, they're really going to make a big push for the UFC, really going to maybe go into title contention in the next 2 or 3 years that we've had recently in the last 24 months. One of them being Sabina Mazo, who we haven't really seen pan out as well as you thought you would see. Listen, Colombian fighter... You know, kind of reminiscent of Alejandra Lara that we've seen in Bellator as well. Kind of taking the same route the two of them have. But the one that's really shone, really bright, she has huge aspirations. Listen, she wants to break a John Jones record. So that's
tough thing to do.
Pretty high company. But Maycee Barber, she's already 2-0 in the UFC. I think she is primed for success. I think once she fights, there's some really tough
like she's fighting
tests.
Jillian Robertson in her next fight, and that's gonna be one of the tougher tests of her career. And
Especially where it's in Canada too against a Canadian.
Exactly, and one who's a phenomenal grappler at that. I mean, and again, not to make this a Jillian Robertson show, but she's one of these people you really want to test a young star like Maycee Barber. And I know it's kind of like one of those prospect versus prospect fights, and the winner of that's definitely going to propel themselves at that division. And in division as shallow as flyweight too, one or two good wins can really put you into that title contention.
And I mean, listen, Robertson coming off a big win very, very recently, but you look at Maycee Barber and the skill set she possesses, her strikes are top notch. She does have a lot of power as well. So one of those things that you have to worry about with Maycee Barber, but she's one of our top 5 from season 2 as far as success. Now there's 2 left. I'm going to go with a softball here. A guy who's already 2-1 and a lightning rod for controversy in the UFC. A guy who got a development deal. We already mentioned him in Greg Hardy. And I know the majority of the narrative is negative, but you look at those 2 wins, and again, you want to talk softball. I mean, poor Dmitry Smolyakov. That was rough.
I'm 99% sure Craig could have beaten him.
But the win against Juan Adams, you saw him neutralize the takedown attempt. Juan Adams went way too deep, and like an ankle pick where, I mean, he was trying to pick into ice, and instead of picking it, he froze into it. He just froze on that ankle. And Greg Hardy, all he had to do was just flail away and get the win. But his ceiling is high for sure. I know a lot of people, doubters, haters alike, have said, listen, put him up against Derek Lewis. Put him up against, somebody in the top
People just
5.
want to see him get knocked out.
They're not going to do that. They're just going to keep working him in. He's still early in his career. And he's one of those guys that keeps saying, I'm growing every fight. And it's hard not to agree with that statement because you just look at the progression that he's able to have. He's one of those guys that has to kind of cool the temper, obviously. But he's one of those guys that, his ceiling definitely is high. He's relatively young for the heavyweight division. He's certainly young in fight years. I mean, compared to, pick a guy like Derek Lewis. He's been fighting for the longest time. And if you want to consider somebody maybe a journeyman in the heavyweight division, there are plenty, but he would be one of them. But Greg Hardy, I mean, he's under 10 professional fights, so he's got room to improve.
He's one of those guys, no matter what you think of him personally, professionally, just looking at his experience, his kind of improvements fight to fight, he is going to be a problem in the heavyweight division, I feel at least, but he's not going to be a problem for a couple of years. Yeah. And if you want, you could say, rush him into Derek Lewis, rush him into Francis Ngannou, because they're going to beat him. It doesn't matter.
Cyril Gane.
Exactly. Those types of people would beat him, but if you want to see them develop a real prospect, this is how you do it. Don't do the Aaron Pico route where you're like, let's have him fight all these top-ranked fighters and he gets knocked out. No, you want to go real slow, real slow, real slow. Give him different challenges as he moves his way up until he can kind of develop that full set of skills. So they are developing him the right way, no matter what you think of him personally. So Greg Hardy definitely belongs on this list.
And then our 5th fighter from Season 2 of Dana White's Contender Series. Good. This guy's already 3-0. I mean, he's way below 25. He's super young. His older brother is going to be fighting in this season of the Contender Series, crazy, which gives it away. Edmen Shahbazyan, 3-0 in his UFC tenure. Listen, his first fight,
awful.
Yikes. I mean, the cardio is definitely an issue.
I jumped off his train.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that Darren Stewart had won that fight. But since then, 2 really quick finishes in his last 2 fights, and this guy looks like he could be a force.
Edmen Shahbazyan is a problem. I mean, his wrestling's phenomenal, even though he comes from head movement, Edmen Tarverdi, and
Ronda Rousey's his head coach.
Exactly. You would think that he'd be very striking heavy, but his grappling's phenomenal. He's one of the better wrestlers at the middleweight division, even given his youth and kind of lack of experience. But he can really do it all. He's a very well-rounded MMA fighter. He's definitely wrestling heavy, but if the fight stays on the feet, he's more than adept in dealing with any issues.
All right, Matt. So Season 2 of Dana White's Contender Series, now it was still somewhat fresh in our minds last summer, and it still is now, because we had the first week, there was a lot of controversy in this episode, and we had a lot of people that were actually signed into the UFC. So if we go bottom to top, we had Kevin Holland, Montel Jackson, Greg Hardy, and he was taking on Austin Lane. That was a big fight because both those guys both competed in the NFL. It was a huge seller. Season 2 was going off,
It started strong.
It did start strong. You had Chris Curtis and Sean Lally, which was a really big fight. I mean, Sean Lally was, one of those guys on the regional scene that a lot of people recognize. Chris Curtis finishes him with a hook kick and follows it up by TKO. And then doesn't get a contract, and then he retires, which he's done a couple times since. He had pretty decent success with PFL this past season, but he's bounced around since. a lot of people wanted him to get a contract. And then in your main event, you had Alonzo Menifield taking on Deshaun Boatwright. Alonzo Menifield getting the win there. He ends up in the UFC. Greg Hardy gets a contract. And Kevin Holland, while he didn't get a contract, he eventually I was going to
say, Kevin Holland's fought more than both those guys combined in the UFC.
They brought Kevin Holland in at UFC 227. A lot of people recognized them. That kicked off the main card of the pay-per-view, and he faced Thiago Santos.
That's such a hard draw.
He didn't get knocked out. He got taken down a lot.
He got beat up for like 14 and a half minutes.
But out of that week 1, there's a couple of guys that have made some noise, but there's one guy that I think is going to be consistent in the UFC and ranked, and I know a lot of people aren't going to want to hear it, but I think Greg Hardy...
I disagree so much.
I think he's a top 15 UFC heavyweight just because it's a division where...
Oh, it's shallow.
Yeah, it's shallow.
But here's the problem. Montel Jackson, just as a fighter, is so much better than Greg Hardy. I get that due to the division, Greg Hardy might be a little bit higher rankings-wise because the division's a lot more shallow, but as a pure talent, and Montel Jackson's had some bad performances in the UFC too, but him at his best is actually a guy who you could see maybe one day getting into the top 15. Maybe not staying around for a long time, but he always puts on exciting fights. I would say he'd be my highest of those. But even Greg Hardy, controversy aside and whatnot, I think we've learned a few things from Greg Hardy. He's better than a lot of people want to admit that he is, but he's a lot more boring than people realize. Like Greg Hardy, when he fights an actual good fighter, the Ben Soli fight, I know the puffer was a problem in that, but it kind of showed that he has that little bit of a burst and then he slows down. And he's not really fighting the highest skill level guys right now, and that's why I don't know if I can put him in that top 15, just because we haven't seen him other than Volkov. We haven't really seen him against anyone good yet, because there's been such a big difference between, okay, Ben Soli and Alexander Volkov that I don't really know where we can put his ceiling. We just know it's in between those two fighters, but that's such a big range that it's really hard to see where he's going to
I think top 15 is kind of where he'll stay. Whether he advances up into top 10 category, that remains to be seen, but he has faced top 10, maybe even top 5 talent before with Volkov.
But it's just one fight. That's my point. Like it's really hard to say from that one fight.
So if we move on, week 2 was where you get a contract, everybody gets a contract, and there's a couple of names that we've already talked about. This is where Ryan Spann got a contract. If we go from bottom to top again, Dwight Grant, Ryan Spann, Austin Springer gets a win over Giga Chikadze, and we end up seeing Giga Chikadze in the UFC. Anthony Hernandez, who competes at middleweight, and Matt Sayles getting the win over Yazan Hedgie. Now, this is where, again, we've seen these guys in the UFC. We've seen Matt Sayles, Anthony Hernandez. We haven't seen a lot of him in the UFC. And I know, he won that fight, overturned to no contest because he tested positive for marijuana, which, again, it's just one of those things. I wish we could see more of Anthony Hernandez because I have no idea what his ceiling is.
No.
He's looked good in the UFC. It's just we haven't seen enough of him.
It's a dumb rule, but still follow it. Like, that's all you have to do.
The only person I would say in terms of high ceiling and getting ranked in their division, Ryan Spann right now. Ryan Spann's looked pretty good. He had that win over one of the Nogueira brothers.
Minotauro Nogueira at 39 is telling you Ryan Spann's okay. Carl Roberson knocked him out in like 5 seconds though, so it's really hard to say that he's going to be a top talent, and he beat an old man up in his last fight, but like I don't know if I'd say that. But.
All right, so we move on to week 3. We had quite a few different people ending up in the UFC. If you go bottom to top, Jordan Williams getting the win over Tim Karen. Jordan Williams right now petitioning for bigger and better things. I know Mike Heck just had a really good interview with him, and he's kind of made the rounds there. And his story from that week was the fact that he's type 1 diabetic, and he was using it was animal grade insulin because he couldn't afford actual insulin. It costs a lot of money in the States, which living in Canada, it was crazy to hear that story because something like that probably wouldn't happen up here for us. But Jordan Williams, continuing to fight. It's crazy. Julian Rosa got a win over Jamal Emmers. Couple of recognizable names there. Julian Rosa getting his second shot in the UFC, third shot. He's been around
for a little while.
Josh Parisian getting the win over Greg Rebello, who came back in from season 1 into season 2. Now I'm going to stop with our co-main and our main event. We had T. Edwards getting a win over Austin Tweedy. We had Antonina Shevchenko getting a win over Jamie Navarra. Antonina Shevchenko at women's flyweight is always going to be in a weird spot. It's like being Nick Serra. Your brother's Matt Serra. You're going to have a weird run in the UFC. Antonina Shevchenko, for her, she's in the same division as her sister. So let's say Antonina Shevchenko hypothetically goes on a heater.
It's not going to happen, though.
But she's probably not going to fight her sister. No. And I think her ceiling's capped at 125. Now, T. Edwards came in with a lot of promise, and then all of a sudden he fights Don Madge, who
go out there and look, because Don Madge is having a hard time. Like, the UFC is not offering him fights.
He'll land a 1-2 head kick, though, and it'll put you to sleep real quick.
Yeah, T. Edwards, I mean, he's only had 2 fights in the UFC.
Dennis Bermudez was the second one. And in the Bermudez fight, he just didn't have cardio. Like, he looked really good for 30 seconds, and it was one of those, like, Kimbo Slice things where it wasn't like a gradual decline. It was, oh no, he exploded. I think he dropped Bermudez. Bermudez gets right back up because he's dropped in every fight. And then Edwards just had nothing left in the gas tank after that little explosion. I mean, we just got done watching that Shane Carwin fight. It was kind of similar to Shane Carwin Brock Lesnar, where there was such a big difference between that first and second round. But in the T. Edwards fight, it was such a big difference between the first and second minute. So really weird performance. He's been one of the guys I've been the most disappointed with, if I can be completely honest, in two Snake Contender
and I want to turn that around. I wish we get to see some more of him. I really do.
Too, but I just think from the 2 performances you've shown me, you got knocked out by a guy who no one knew who he was. Now, of course, Madge is a really good fighter, and no one knew at the time, but still, we have to take the loss at the time. And then Dennis Bermudez, who had lost 4 in a row, and he was going to retire after that fight, and he had barely trained, and he still beat the brakes off him. So when those are your 2 losses in the UFC, I don't know if you get a third chance. If it was maybe lose a split decision and then lose a unanimous one, and you had kind of excuses for both, but no, you lost to a guy retired and to a guy who not a lot of people have heard of. So it's unfortunate that was his trajectory, but him and Antonina Shevchenko, I like what you said, she's kind of stuck in that division because Valentina's not going to lose that belt for a very long time. And Antonina is always going to be that Shevchenko sister. And it's unfortunate that that's what she's known as, but like, he's Mr. Fight Night Picks, and I'm just the guy who sits to the left, I guess. So Antonina, I don't know if she could ever make 115. I would like to see her maybe try, maybe 135, just whatever's easiest for her. But I don't know if she's ever going to make it in that top 10. Even in a shallow division, that Roxanne Modafferi fight, and she's been kind of the hype killer at that division as of late, but that fight really ruined the Shevchenko train for me. I was on board. I wasn't the conductor, but I was definitely near the front of the train, and then that fight just sort of ruined it for me.
Was not on the caboose. So we move into week number 4, and again, quite a few names that ended up in the UFC. You had Jalen Turner, you had Jordan Espinosa, you had Bevon Lewis and Kevin Aguilar. Now Bevon Lewis goes from a developmental deal. He gets a full contract. And in that, lightweight main event where you have Kevin Aguilar winning a split, I know Kevin Aguilar didn't get signed to a contract, but he ended up in the UFC. I mean, he just fought a tough fight and a tough opponent where it was wrestling versus wrestling. But Kevin Aguilar at lightweight, maybe he's not ranked, but I think he's going to have some more competitive fights in the UFC.
I think that's an important thing to say. Just because we're saying a guy's not going to be champion doesn't mean you can't be a big fan of these people. Like, Edmen Shahbazyan's a guy we're about to talk about, and I think he does have one of the higher ceilings out of anyone, but even if you're not going to be a champ, it doesn't mean, like, your career's kind of over. Like, there's so many good fighters who don't have a number next to their name who just put on really exciting fights, and there's a lot of people from these seasons who I can see just being those people for a lot of their career.
So if we go into week number 5, where Matt's alluding to, and we'll talk about the people that ended up in the UFC. Listen, we had Edmen Shahbazyan, Domingo Pilarte, and Maycee Barber from this episode. And, special shout out, I guess, Vince Morales, who a lot of people recognize, and Austin Vanderford, who just so happened to end up in Bellator. Exactly. So it's worth mentioning. But, okay, so we have 3 fighters there. One of those fighters, Domingo Pilarte, just had his last fight overturned from a first-round knockout loss to an 0 contest against Journey Newsome, who tested positive for marijuana metabolites again. Now, the 2 fighters that won contracts here, very, very high ceilings and very young and early in their careers. We have Edmen Shahbazyan and Maycee Barber. Now, I know Maycee Barber, when we talked about her last summer, there was still a lot of shine. Now, a lot of that went away when she fought Roxanne Modafferi. I still think that you can still have some hype and you can still have a lot of belief because, again, she's so young in her career. Like, I know
the division show.
I know, let's compare and make the comparison. So she wanted to be the youngest champion in UFC history over John Jones. John Jones lost the fight when he was in and around that time to Matt Hamill.
Really?
He lost.
There's levels to losses, though. That's not a great
That's true. Maycee Barber, she lost that fight to Roxanne Modafferi. But, again, it can either be a total lump, like you had when... And it's not easy to compare them.
She tore ACL, that's my thing. Like, we're not going to see her for 8 months at the minimum no matter what.
So she can either take a lump like Ronda Rousey did and absolutely just let it derail her, or she can come back stronger. And it's tough off when you have a major knee injury. It's tough.
We're not going to see a new and improved Maycee Barber for about a year and a half. That's the problem. We're going to see her back once after the ACL. She's probably not going to look very good. And then once after that. So she needs kind of a warm-up fight for us to really know how much that injury affected her, because ACLs are weird. They either affect you a lot or they don't affect you at all, and it doesn't really... There's only a body type. You can't be built like Mark Hunt and Terry ACL, and I can 100% say, oh, that person's never going to be the same. They could come back and be 100% fine. They could come back and never be the same. It's a big problem in basketball. But for Maycee, with her being so young, that shouldn't be too bad of a recovery. She should be able to get back to at least close to 100%. And I do agree with you. I feel like out of this season especially, she has one of the higher ceilings, but that loss was just so bad. You can't go and tear your ACL and basically get TKO'd multiple times in that fight, because she wasn't fighting back for a lot of it, and then just keep on talking your trash. So, like, I agree. You hope that she comes out of it kind of like Tony Ferguson, where you're just training really hard every day, and you want to make that new and improved, better version of yourself, but this season, or this whole episode, just has to be talked about Edmen Shahbazyan. The leaps and improvements that this guy has made since that Darren Stewart fight, like, where I was so down on him. And
from Darren Stewart to Brad Tavares, the jump in competition, the jump in the rankings, the jump in name value.
Not even the fact that he won a split decision to Darren Stewart and then knocked out Brad Tavares with a head kick in the first round. Like, that's the leap this guy's taken in 1 year. Now, Edmen Shahbazyan trains under one of the greatest coaches ever,
Edmond Tarverdi.
Exactly.
And his head coach was Ronda Rousey.
Yes, and she acted as manager too. But Edmen Shahbazyan, I don't know if he'll be a champion, but I think we will see him in a title fight at some point in his career. I'd really like to see him and Adesanya match up. I know Adesanya's a little bit older, but he's still sort of the younger guy in the division. He's a little bit newer to the UFC, but that would be such a huge fight down in the future. I think so. Both guys really good on the mic. I have very high hopes for Edmen Shahbazyan, at least now in his career. I'd really like to see him get matched up against some of those higher guys in 185. This is what I hope they don't do, though, because I think matchmaking is very key at this point in his career. Don't make him fight Yoel Romero next. Because I've seen some people on Twitter talking about how they want to see Edmen Shahbazyan fight Yoel Romero. And if you want to derail a hype train, make your favorite fighter fight Yoel Romero. Because even if he wins, and let's say Edmen Shahbazyan goes out there and puts on a display, he's not going to be the same fighter afterwards unless it's a boring fight like the Adesanya one. So Edmen Shahbazyan, out of everyone in the whole show, I think he has the high ceiling.
Okay, now we go to week 6. And again, you talk about high ceilings. There's fighters from week 6 that I think also have high ceilings. Now, we start off at the bottom. So you have Chase Hooper getting a win. He gets a developmental contract. He ends up in the UFC. A lot of people...
Good Twitter game.
Good Twitter game. And a lot of people thought, okay, still, he's way too young. He's small for the division at featherweight. Like, he's really tall, skinny, and long. And they put him in there against one of the Tamor brothers.
Daniel.
And we picked...
Little Tamer.
Chase Hooper to win that fight. We get a lot of hate for picking Chase Hooper to win that fight.
I'm not even going to say that I thought he was going to win. I just know Daniel Tamer's not amazing, and that's why I picked A.
But Chase Hooper looked good. He got cracked.
He did.
But he looked out. Yeah, exactly. He fought through adversity and got a win. I don't know what his ceiling is. I don't know if he's going to be future champion at 145, if he's going to be ranked at 145.
For M&Ms.
But Chase Hooper, listen, so far he's marketed himself well.
Enjoy the ride.
He's on the way up. We won't cap him. Jeff Hughes gets a win over Josh Appel.
I'll put a cap on Jeff Hughes.
Jeff Hughes has a fight. He had a fight booked for Portland. It wasn't Columbus. I think it was Portland against Tanner Boser. Again, another litmus test fight. But Jeff Hughes hasn't really done it in terms of the UFC. Former LFA champ. Then you had Sodiq Yusuff fighting Mike Davis. I want to say this. I think Sodiq Yusuff has a high ceiling at lightweight. If cardio isn't an issue for Sodiq Yusuff, I think he can be a superstar. He fought Mike Davis. Go back and watch Mike Davis's last fight over Thomas Gifford. Holy smokes. Holy smokes. Mike Davis had a good fight, but we're focusing on Sodiq Yusuff. I don't know what's next for him, but this is a guy that I want to see more in the UFC. I know we focused on it a lot in our earlier, kind of go over of season 2, but he's one of those guys that I think has a really high ceiling.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Sodiq Yusuff at 145. It's been interesting, though, because as his level of competition started to get a little bit better in his last couple fights, we've noticed that he's not just going out there and knocking everyone out to the same degree that he was when he first came in the UFC. Benito Lopez, he did knock him out in the first round, but still, he got cracked, he got dropped at one point, and he faced a lot of adversity. And then his last one against Andre Fili, it was a close fight when the judges' scorecards came in. I thought he did win, but Fili landed some good shots, and he made him work for everything.
And Andre Fili, if you want to talk a guy, that's been around the UFC forever, and you wouldn't think it, and he's still young, too, which is weird.
Way back in the day.
But again, you talk litmus test, that's a really good litmus test 100%. For a young guy on his way up. And I think Sodiq Yusuff, will he be champ tomorrow? Probably not. But it's always good to see a guy like Sodiq Yusuff coming off Contender Series, getting those big impressive wins, getting jumps up in competition, and I think, again, future star.
I know who I want to see him fight next, too. If Calvin Kattar beats Jeremy Stephens, and if they decide to keep those two together, I want to see him fight Jeremy Stephens.
That's fair. I think there's lots of different, stylistic matchups you can make at 45.
That's the hardest thing with saying Sodiq Yusuff is going to be champion or going to fight in a title fight. For that to happen, he has to beat Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, maybe Jose Aldo, Jeremy Stevens, Yair Rodriguez, Zabit, Korean Zombie, Brian Ortega. Like, those are the top 6 or 7 in that division. So it's just that division's so good, right? Like, historically great right now. So
Yeah.
it's a long path to get to there.
And don't push him too far.
Exactly.
Please
That's a
don't
really good
push him
point.
too far.
Take your time.
Then, of course, in your co-main, in your main, you have Alex Munoz getting the win over Nick Newell. And then in your co-main, Jimmy Crute gets a win. Now, Jimmy Crute at 205, yeah, it's been good, it's been bad. So at this point, it's been good. I mean, he won his last fight over Michael Olszewczuk in, it was in Auckland in 2020.
In seconds.
Yeah, I mean, a great win there. So for Jimmy Crute, again, he's one of those guys that it's tough to try and predict what the trajectory is at 205 pounds because we don't even know if our champion's still our champion right now in John Jones at the time of filming this. So for Jimmy Crute, I think a ranking next to his name wouldn't be out of the question.
His name's Johnny Walker.
It's just going to be tough against some good competition.
It is, but and again, Jimmy Crute, he's kind of lucky that he's in the division that he's in. He's a big guy for 205. Sorry, he's a decent grappler if he's the offensive one. If he's the one initiating the grappling, if he's taking people down, really good. We saw that in his last fight. The problem though is when we see him on his back, when he's on the back foot, that's when he kind of starts to struggle a little bit. So still kind of a raw talent, but he's showing a lot of promise.
So then we move on to week number 7, and we're going in depth on these seasons of Contender Series just to offer a bit of a recap. So week 7, we had quite a few people that ended up in the UFC. We have Juan Adams, Jordan Griffin, Ian Heinisch, Don'Tale Mayes, and Roosevelt Roberts. Now, not all of those guys got contracts. 4 of them did. The one guy that didn't was Don'Tale Mayes, but he ended up in the UFC and fighting Cyril Gane. Now, this was his second time on Contender Series. Now, out of all of these guys, Juan Adams no longer with the UFCs with Aries FC. Jordan Griffin just got a big win. Like, he needed that win because it wasn't trending all that well. But for Jordan Griffin, again, I don't know if he ends up with a name or a number next to his name anytime soon. Ian Heinisch has had that number, and then it didn't go well.
His last
time out.
That Russian cat whose name evades me. Ian Heinisch is weird because it's like he's always tired from the second he walks into the cage, but he just never gets more tired. So he starts at about a 6 out of 10 on the cardio scale, and then he just stays there. And that's it. And he's just sort of this marauding force. He's always going to walk forward. He's always going to do what he does well. And the Derek Brunson fight, which wasn't that long ago, dropped him with a head kick a minute into the fight, and it looked like it was going his way immediately. But the problem is, Ian Heinisch doesn't have that second or third gear. He's a power puncher, but he likes to back up. So it's a really odd kind of combination. It reminds me of Lorenz Larkin, because Lorenz Larkin, when you look, he has good power, but he's more like a volume guy, but he chooses the pot shot, and that's what Ian Heinisch reminds me of.
And the thing with Ian Heinisch, too, like, they bring him into the UFC, so he gets a win over Justin Sumter on this season of Dana White's Contender Series. Then they put him against Cesar Fajea, who's had some big fights.
Yeah, on short notice, and it was a great fight.
And then they put him up against Shoeface, Antonio Carlos Jr., and he fights well. He got out of some very difficult positions. And then they go, you know what? Derek Brunson, there's your next guy. And, you know, in terms of Ian Heinisch, really good wrestling and good power as well. But against a guy like Derek Brunson, all right, that was too tough of a test. Then they move back a little bit, Omari Akhmedov, and then it didn't go well from there either.
And that fight was weird because it was like he was fighting a mirror the whole time because both guys sort of do the same thing. So Ian Heinisch, I know he's lost 2 in a row. I don't think it's it for him, though. Like, they're going to give him more opportunities, and he will win more fights sooner rather than later. It was kind of wild, though. Like, 2 fights into his UFC career, he just beat Shoeface, and they're talking about Channing Tatum playing him in a movie all of a sudden. So it was really weird to see how fast his career was sort of trending upwards. And these 2 losses have 100% put a damper on it, but I don't think this is the end for Ian Heinisch, and I think we will see him with a number next to his name in the near future.
And then you move on to week number 8. Again, we get Greg Hardy in a main event, gets another win. Devonte Smith gets a win, and then you also have Kennedy Nzechukwu getting another win on Contender Series, finally getting that contract. Bobby Moffett gets a contract, and yeah, that rounds out the second season. So for me, just based off of name value, there were a lot of signings. There are a lot of people that are still with the UFC, still putting on good performances and getting wins. I don't know if I'd probably say season 1 above season 2. I'd probably rank them 1, 2, and 3 if it was just me, based on the fact that season 1 made such an immediate impact that we've had 3 seasons plus a Brazilian season, and we had 2 possible contenders come out of the first season.
With season 2, I feel like we have a lot more good fighters, but season 1 has the best fighters out of the whole group. So season 2, a lot more volume. You get a lot more guys you can recognize in the UFC at this point. But no, season 1, I feel like had the better ones when you really get to the top with Jeff Neal, of course, and Sean O'Malley.
So if we go back, let's listen to our take on season 3. I know we didn't really get into it a whole lot, but we'll offer a bit of a recap because, again, when we did this original episode, it was August of 2019, so it was still a little too